6:04, got 24 people on. Let's go. Let's get her done. So, welcome to our little podcast, Katya. So, this is Dr. Katya Rhodes from the University of Victoria. I'll do a brief intro, and if you want to just maybe give a bit more of your background. So, you're currently an assistant professor in the School of Public Admin, and you're also affiliated, you're a member of the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at UVic. And it says you're also interim president at the Canadian Society for Ecological Economics. Interesting. And the work that you're doing right now is focusing on low carbon transitions and climate policies, basically energy economy modeling. However, you have spent a fair bit of your time not in academia, working in the policy environment at the provincial level. And I believe you've done some work with Vancouver as well, the city of Vancouver. On looking at, I guess, modeling energy using and applying energy economy models to support policy making, correct? And you've also worked with not-for-profit with the Pembina Institute. I think I saw you did some work with Pembina as well. So you've got you're one of the academics that I know that is doing research in the peer-reviewed context, but you've had plenty of time outside in the real world, rolling up your sleeves and seeing how these models and so forth actually work or do not work. What we're going to talk about tonight is some pathways for climate success using policy tools, and potentially not success as well, I guess, if we don't do some things properly. And the role of economics in that, the economic arguments and so forth, and policy instruments that are economically based, and whether or not politicians and the decisions that they make and the policies that they put forth are helping or not helping the cause. That's kind of in a nutshell. So welcome to the show, and I'm glad everybody made it out tonight. I know you're busy, but this should be a very interesting discussion from someone who's doing really important work and who knows what she's doing. So what brought you to this work in terms of your background and your professional interests? Like, how did you arrive at this really hot area of work right now?
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, David, and everyone. Thanks for attending the podcast. Pretty accurate description. I would just add that I use a lot of survey tools to study people's behavior in order to design those energy economy models to be realistic about how people make choices about purchasing different types of technology. So I'm originally from Russia, as you can hear from my accent. I did my undergraduate degree there in economics, and then I did my second degree, master's degree in business in England, nothing to do with sustainability and climate. And actually thinking back, I'm shocked right now that as part of my master's degree back in 2009, we were not trained in any aspects of social or environmental responsibility when talking about international business development. So back then it was 2009, and the financial crisis hit. There were no jobs in Europe, especially for immigrants in any business field. So I decided to go to Vancouver. My roommate was from Vancouver. She said it's the best place on earth. And in Vancouver, I was fortunate enough to get my very first job in Canada in the Vancouver Economic Commission. It's a not-for-profit that deals with the city of Vancouver directly. And they were looking for a person to quantify green jobs in the city, as well as to create a database of clean technology businesses in the city. Something that wasn't done before, was just emerging. The word sustainability was just starting to become a buzzword, and I knew nothing about it. I just got interested. I said yes, and I think that was the very first step to develop a green jobs methodology in more of a real life setting. And as part of that work, I learned about Dr. Mark Jacquard's research lab at Simon Fraser University, about the aspect of that lab that had to do with political acceptance of climate policy, designing policies that are both effective in achieving their goals, reducing emissions, as well as are politically acceptable. So I became very interested in that kind of political economy world back then. And I think it was also an interesting time because back in 2009, the BC government introduced a bunch of really cool policies, including the first in North America carbon tax and several regulations that created this very interesting kind of experimental case to study being there in Vancouver.
And you landed with a great guy, Dr. Mark Jacquard. So I remember when I was even doing my undergrad, I had read some of his work. I mean, he wrote the book, it was his first book, Sustainable Fossil Fuels.
Yeah, it was quote there as well.
Yeah, that was a famous one because of, the green people hated it because it yet it was putting forth some pretty compelling arguments for, moving forward by still addressing the reality in that we're in. And then I remember him giving a lecture. I saw him give a lecture in which he was talking about technology risk, where he had gone and purchased a lot of renewable light bulbs and so forth, and came home with them. And then I guess they dropped them or something on the way to take them in the house, like just demonstrating that, new technology is a great idea, but sometimes it doesn't work, or it's not functioning up to snuff, and you've got to account for that in how you model policy and so forth. So let's get into it. We've got some slides, and I'm gonna share my screen now. So the main focus of your work right now, what would you say the main focus of your work currently is?
Well, I'm a very interdisciplinary researcher. The main focus is climate policy design. I'm trying to do my best to produce policy relevant research. I'm not interested in developing more theoretical frameworks. I think we have enough. So I'm currently studying the coexistence of climate sustainability with economic growth worldwide under a large Swedish research grant with collaborators in Sweden and Switzerland. And I'm also studying citizen perceptions, public perceptions of low carbon heating technology. We know quite a bit about electric vehicles, why and how people adopt them, and what kind of policies we need to implement to make the transition happen from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles. We don't know much about residential heating technology, why people are not adopting heat pumps, and we know from all modeling studies that electric heat pumps will be the key technology in decarbonizing our buildings. So I'm currently focusing on those kind of two big areas of research in order to, again, inform our modeling tools and to create realistic, effective, and politically acceptable climate proposals.
So given that position, then, why should people care then? That's the question. Why should there be a sense of alarm on the part of the public to cause them to not, or to go a certain technological route, or to not go a certain technological route?
Well, first of all, I think your question is quite big. I don't think that everyone should care. In fact, it's too much work to convince everyone to believe that climate change is real. And that's why part of my work has to do with measuring public awareness of climate change and climate policy, and understanding who needs to be aware, how, and who those people are voting for. Generally speaking, you have the slide on the screen right now. There are a couple of reasons for caring in general. First of all, or at least at the government level, it's hard to not be concerned because all jurisdictions worldwide are already experiencing a lot of impacts from climate change. BC has been prone to some of the most unique climate change impacts, including massive pine beetle outbreaks resulting in the loss of millions of hectares of land, and as well as forest fires and intensifying grassland fires. These and other impacts are projected to worsen into the future if we keep burning fossil fuels. And this slide here shows exactly that. So we've currently exceeded the 1 degree temperature change by the end of the century, and the whole international scientific community agrees that we should not exceed the 2-degree temperature increase by the end of the century compared to our pre-industrial emission levels, because beyond the 2-degree point, we are very likely to experience some tipping points. Those are the situations when we will see increased risks of dangerous feedbacks and large-scale shifts in climate systems. There will be a rise in intensity of droughts, floods, heat waves, forest fires. In terms of ecosystems, we will see an increasing number of species extinctions. Our water and food systems would be affected quite dramatically. And currently, with the current path of our emissions worldwide, we are on the path to exceed the 4-degree temperature change, which by all means will have some pretty significant implications for the entire world, with developing countries being affected in the most dramatic way, given their lack of resources to deal with those environmental disasters and associated economic impacts.
And just to add to that, already in some of the work that I'm doing with my team as well, with, for instance, as mentioned before, with small island developing states in the Caribbean and so forth, already some of the things that we see and we are contending with from an adaptation standpoint is, in fact, on the ecosystem level, damage to coral reefs. We're seeing it, like it's not a myth, it's actually happening, as well as higher intensity of storms, particularly the higher frequency of storms coming in on storm paths, and intensity as well. So we're seeing more of them and they're stronger. And that's the science that goes along with that is done by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. So just for those that are watching, I mean, often you hear these kind of like, this is going to happen and, you know, we got to change now or else. But it's not a case of necessarily or else in this opinion. It is, and it's already happening. So we're already seeing we're seeing the reality and truth of the models playing out in reality right now. And what's alarming about a slide like this, if you look at the trajectory we are on, if we don't put in some measures to change these trajectories, then we will be experiencing far more disruptive and in some cases potentially irreversible or catastrophic shifts, such as the tipping points that Katyas mentioned. So the next slide we talk about is actually trajectories. So this is one of the slides you shared in terms of probably the ideal scenario versus the less than ideal scenario.
Yeah, so this is a very conservative slide indeed, and it's showing our current path on the dotted line, the path to 4 to 6 degree temperature change by the end of the century if we keep burning fossil fuels at the same rate. We are now in 2021, not 2020, and our emissions must start declining now or yesterday in order to not exceed the 2-degree temperature change with a 50-50% chance. So this is not a 100% chance. If we want to get to that 50% chance, our emissions must decline by 50 to 75% in 30 years by 2050. But all the scientists tell us that emissions should be 0 or below 0, as currently stated in all the IPCC reports, to avoid those catastrophic impacts beyond the 2-degree temperature change.
So what this shows us then is there is a very immediate need for decarbonization and to figure out paths towards decarbonization. So given that, this calls for the demand for your work. And the question is, well, why don't we just do it? You know, why is it so hard to decarbonize?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, and I categorize them into like 3 main challenges, and there are also additional ones that complicate these challenges. There is this traditional myth that fossil fuels are scarce and expensive. Well, we know that fossil fuels are non-renewable resources, and in theory, we can in fact run out of them. But in fact, fossil fuels are plentiful, high quality, and low cost. And with the increase in innovation, their price falls constantly, and with increasing decrease in demand, such as the demand in its current form due to the COVID pandemic. Again, the price for fossil fuels is decreasing. So what that means is that it's more difficult for an electric vehicle to compete with the gasoline vehicle at the moment. And all the countries, all the political decision makers know that quite well. That's why they use fossil fuels as the cheapest path for development. And China has done that in the last 3 decades. So we know we're not going to run out of fossil fuels because of ongoing innovation, and we're not going to run out of fossil fuels on time to address the climate change issue. In fact, we keep discovering all these unconventional sources. When people say there is a peak oil, people refer to conventional sources. In fact, there are so many other alternatives that keep appearing, keep becoming cheaper. Even oil sands are now profitable. Shale oil, tight oil, enhanced oil recovery, all of those alternative backup fuels are still cheaper than renewables. And if you go to my next slide, David, there is this myth associated with fossil fuels that renewables are so cheap that it makes just all the sense to use them. But in fact, they're still not as cheap as fossil fuels without stringent climate policy in place. This graph here shows global energy use in terms of annual increases of using fossil fuels in black versus renewable and nuclear fuels in green. And you can see that there is absolutely no trend in this graph. There are some coincidences. So when we signed the Paris Agreement back in 2015, the annual increase in renewables was as high or even slightly higher than the annual increase in the use of fossil fuels. But then that trend reversed. And why is that? It's because we discovered more shale gas. So without a stringent compulsory policy in place, renewables will not be winning. So that's the first challenge. The next challenge, well, and with that, fossil fuels are also still, the use of them is growing, and therefore emissions are growing. And when in some countries, developed countries, we implementing policy to restrict the use of fossil fuels, so we see more of a less stabilization in the amount of emissions per year. Developing countries want to achieve the same level of development as the developed world has, and for that, fossil fuels are the cheapest resource. So the second challenge, if you go to the next slide, relates to this idea of a global agreement, a voluntary global agreement, which makes complete sense. Decarbonization requires collective global efforts. We here in British Columbia and in Canada are only a fraction of a problem. Our emissions are something like 2% of global emissions, and therefore we are a fraction of a solution. So everyone wants others to act at the same time. But we know that global governance institutions are really weak, and our diplomacy is very ineffective. In addition to that, we have rich and poor countries constantly disagreeing on the fair sharing of the cost for climate change mitigation. And for 25 years, we have tried to negotiate a voluntary binding agreement. And I have no faith in that kind of agreement happening that would make all members of the world act on climate change for this and many other reasons.
Well,
And
also just if I may add to that as well, because we do a lot of work on both in the CBD and UNFCCC, and go to the COPs and so forth and see the big celebrations about the agreements, but we need to keep in mind that if you don't meet your objectives, and like it's politically embarrassing perhaps in some way, that might be one consequence, but no one's going to come and like slap you on the wrist or put sanctions on you economically because of not meeting your emissions targets. And that's just the reality of it.
Exactly. And there is this third myth, a myth of a rational domestic policy process. So if we are not working together to create a very effective and compulsory global agreement with some penalties and fines for non-compliance, then why don't we just all act domestically? It makes complete sense given all the impacts that we are currently experiencing from climate change and will experience in the future. Well, the fact is that decarbonization is very, very, very difficult, even for the most ambitious climate sincere politicians. And that's because fossil fuels are integrated in all aspects of our lives. So there is a huge financial self-interest that motivates people and businesses to trumpet benefits from the continued use of fossil fuels. And of course, the job of climate sincere politicians is complicated by climate insincere politicians who try to implement those kind of distant targets, something that you just mentioned about global agreements. We have targets, but we don't have any policies that require achieving those targets. So we have targets only with climate insincere politicians without any policies, or we have targets and some distant policies that are not compulsory in their nature and or are very weak in their stringency levels. And we also have these politicians lying to the public, claiming the greatest economic harms come from the most effective, inefficient policies, such as the carbon tax. Be it here in British Columbia, when the NDP government back in 2009 launched the Axe the Tax campaign, be it in Ontario, be it in France. Carbon taxes are very difficult to implement at a stringent enough level to reduce our emissions substantially in any jurisdiction in the world, except for a few places such as Sweden and Norway, where trust in government is really high and people are used to being taxed at very high levels, but we don't live in those jurisdictions, and there are very, very few of those countries that are willing to accept scientific evidence and are willing to pay higher taxes. So,
and we'll get to that towards the latter part of the talk about the current context as to, how do we discern whether or not a politician is insincere, sincere about what they're putting forward? Because this is an important decision for, voters and taxpayers and just citizens of any jurisdiction.
Yeah, and also right now we have this new challenge. It was especially visible at the beginning of the pandemic, when people all started to do this work on how the COVID-19 crisis will permanently change our lifestyles. And because energy consumption is reduced right now, we are not living the same lifestyles as before, but we know that the pandemic is a temporary event. Hopefully with vaccinations, the life will slowly get back to normal. And going back to normal implies that people will go back to using fossil fuels unless governments design their recovery strategies to be very different from the past. And as I said earlier, the pandemic has made fossil fuels cheaper because the oil price plummeted. And decarbonization, therefore, has become more difficult. But I argue that this is also a policy window, because climate currently is not the most immediate threat as compared to health and economic recovery. People are really concerned with their health right now. People are really concerned with making sure that economies function well and we recover as fast as possible so that our businesses work. And in fact, some of the most progressive governments in the world, in G20 countries, have decided to spend their recovery stimuli proposals on clean energy policy, as demonstrated in this graph here. So in lighter colors, you'll see the amount of money that is being directly invested by G20 countries in clean or green energy policy. Of course, the definitions can vary, and I'm currently doing work with this data, but the reality is that many progressive policymakers actually realize this is a good opportunity. This is the time when you don't need to educate everyone about the existence of climate change or the existence of effective climate policy. This is the time to use this policy window to kind of slide these policies and put them in place so that we recover in a low carbon way. And this is exactly what the BC government did back in 2008, 2009, when Gordon Campbell was very excited about doing the same things that Arnold Schwarzenegger, being governor in California, was doing there. Our premier here, Gordon Campbell, decided to implement the carbon tax and a bunch of interesting regulations when the financial crisis in 2009 happened. And as a result, people trusted his government. His government was the liberal government more than other governments in terms of economic recovery. and they simply didn't pay enough attention to the introduction of stringent climate policy.
So which G20 countries jump out at you of ones that fall into this category? There's ones that are of note that are saying, wow, they're really kind of taking advantage of this policy window.
Yeah, so Canada is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
There are some policy, we haven't looked at the most recent climate plan in the US, but Canada and US are one of them. Certain European countries, this is work in progress because you have to be really careful about how those governments define clean or green investments, and whether those include investments into fossil fuel, like the oil and gas sector to decrease emissions from oil and gas, or whether those are actually bailouts. So I wouldn't make any claims. This is just an example of certain jurisdictions trying to utilize this policy window to create climate policy.
Yeah, and it does appear that Canada is making a concerted effort in this area right now, particularly with the release of the new budget. So with this then challenge that we're faced with, this this path to decarbonization, how is it? Is it a complex task? Is it simple? Is it doable? Like how can this be achieved then? What are some key actions or initiatives that can be taken in order to kind of take the trajectory that we previously showed to lead towards, at least aim towards, the level of decarbonization we need to reach?
Yeah, and you've probably heard so many times in newspaper articles or among your circles of friends that in order to achieve deep decarbonization, in order to have a truly zero emission economy, we must change everything in our lives. We must change how we commute to work, to school, what we eat, how we dress, where we live. And that sounds very depressing. It sounds like, there is a substantial lifestyle change that's required for us to move to this zero emission future. It sounds very inconvenient. And empirical evidence as well as research suggests that deep decarbonization does not have to be as complicated as many portray it. There is absolutely a need for behavioral change, but there is also a huge opportunity for emission reductions through technological change in the key polluting sectors in the world, which are transportation and electricity, as shown on this graph. If our emissions continue to rise, and if we don't implement any stringent climate policy in the world, by 2050, most emissions in both developed and developing countries will come from transportation and electricity, followed by buildings and industry. So I suggest that all our efforts need to focus on electricity and transportation first, given the contribution of the sectors to global emissions, and given that in these specific sectors, we already have commercially available technology that is available at low to modest cost, and that can become cheaper with climate policy in place. And we can act in these sectors unilaterally. We don't have to involve all the other competitors that, in trade exposed sectors. These are the sectors that can be decarbonized locally in each separate jurisdiction without signing a global climate agreement. And this is demonstrated in this graph. So in terms of the path, so first, it's very important to focus on the key sectors. And we know what we need to do in the sectors. We need to basically phase out all uses of coal, oil, and followed by most uses of natural gas. And then we need to implement compulsory climate policy. And that's the next slide, because without policy, those actions, the reductions of use of coal, oil, and natural gas will not happen. So in my world, we call climate energy policies either compulsory or non-compulsory. In the last 3 decades, most governments in the world have used non-compulsory policy tools, and those tools include things like, education, ads on the radio, information campaigns, and the Energy Star label on your fridge that suggests if your fridge is better than a conventional fridge, giving subsidies to people to purchase an electric vehicle or any other environmentally friendly technology, and governments spending their own money on green technology. So those policies typically have a very small impact on emissions because they typically are not non-compulsory, so therefore no one has to actually comply with them. There are no penalties or fines associated with non-compliance. And secondly, these policies include a lot of free riders, people who would have completed those actions anyway. So when you give a subsidy to for purchasing a Tesla vehicle, it's very likely that the person who purchased that vehicle does not need a subsidy, so he would be a free rider. There would be no additional emission reductions coming from that particular policy. In contrast, compulsory climate policies can be divided into, generally speaking, carbon pricing and regulation. So carbon pricing can take a form of a carbon tax when we simply tax our emissions, or a cap and trade system where there are regulated agents and there is a cap, general cap, the government sets on emissions, and then agents decide how to achieve that cap, and those who cannot achieve the cap can purchase credits from those who overachieve on emission reductions, and therefore a market price for carbon is established by the industry itself. And in contrast, regulations can be divided into prescriptive, more of the kind of traditional command and control regulations on certain technologies. Government can prescribe that, certain plants or sectors in the economy adopt a particular technology that has zero emissions. Governments could also simply set a cap on emissions without allowing any flexibility. Or governments can implement the so-called flexible climate regulations. These are the mechanisms that basically combine the use of carbon pricing, the mimic the nature of carbon pricing, and command and control regulations. These are market-oriented regulatory mandatory requirements on manufacturers or retailers, and that requires initially they require initially small market share, but then grows over time for a particular technology or fuel or building design with credit trading system as a mechanism for reducing costs of compliance. So some examples include a renewable portfolio standard in electricity. This is a regulation that requires that all electricity sellers achieve a minimum percentage of electricity generated from renewable or zero emission sources. And those who cannot achieve the minimum requirement, the percentage requirement, they can buy credits from those firms who surpass the minimum requirement, such as a wind farm, because a wind farm doesn't have any emissions. So in British Columbia, we have a similar policy. It's called the Clean Electricity Standard. It's even more flexible because it does not prescribe electricity generation from renewables only. It requires that 93 or 98% of electricity in BC is generated from zero emission sources, which implies that we can still have natural gas and coal plants if you want to, but they must use carbon capture and storage technology to remove those emissions from the atmosphere. Another example of a flexible regulation is a zero emission vehicle mandate. We also have it here in British Columbia. It's a requirement for all vehicle sellers to achieve a minimum percentage of zero emission vehicle sales. And those who cannot achieve the minimum requirement, they can buy credits from other vehicle sellers who surpass this minimum requirement, such as Tesla, because Tesla does not produce any cars that emit greenhouse gas emissions. And so through this design, flexible regulations mimic cost savings of carbon pricing. They don't pick technology winners. They allow the regulated sectors to choose how they want to comply with the policies, to choose the cheapest technology that's available to them. And there is this credit trading mechanisms that allows certain sellers to lower their cost of compliance.
And just to rewind one bit here, and just to note for everybody to be careful as well with respect to proposed policies, because there are, now I'm going to rewind back to the Harper years when I kind of started working on this back in 2006, and we had the Turning the Corner plan proposed, in which would have, I guess, be considered compulsory plan, a compulsory policy within that framework, but it wasn't cap and trade, nor was it carbon tax, it was intensity-based emissions, right? Remember that? And so one has to be careful when looking at the details of these even compulsory policies, because given that, and the trick, if I could call it a trick, but the reality behind that was with an intensity-based, even compulsory target, that still allows for growth of greenhouse gas emissions because it's based on the intensity of production of energy, meaning oil and gas, and it doesn't put a hard target necessarily on emissions. So we have to be, like Katya was saying before, we have to be careful about when we look at evaluating these policy frameworks to understand whether or not they are, green or green, like gray green, or however you want to define it. And the devil is in the details, really.
David, do you remember the previous federal election? So we had the Liberal government proposing their climate agenda, and we had the Conservative government. And my previous research group at SFU, they actually modeled both climate plans. Okay. And under the Andrew Scheer climate plan, emissions were projected to actually increase, be higher than the reference case scenario. Huh. So yeah, exactly, you have to pay attention to details. You can't just believe that a climate plan implies that emissions will reduce. In some cases, emissions can increase from a certain type of climate plan.
Intensity-based emissions are a good example of that. Like they could quite easily increase because you're not controlling the production of oil and gas necessarily, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so in fact, most policymakers, what I like about policymakers, that they're actually very smart people. They deal with reality. It's us academics who argue between each other about the most perfect way of reducing emissions. Politicians know it all. It's just very easy to understand, what to do and how. It's a matter of having the right politicians in place. So California, since the creation of the Air Resources Board that was initiated by Arnold Schwarzenegger, he created this semi-judicial structure, institute that has the power to regulate the industry, but does not have a power to tax. And it's almost impossible to remove any policies implemented by the California Air Resources Board because you need to go to court. And in court, it's very difficult to overrule any government regulations in the US. So a completely different governance structure. But anyway, California went the regulatory path for the most part, and they are on track for meeting their emission targets because they primarily relied on flexible and command and control regulations for the emission reductions. It's shown by this graph. By 2025, only 16% of the emission reductions will come from carbon pricing in the form of cap and trade. All other reductions will come from renewable portfolio standard, vehicle emission standard, energy efficiency regulations, as well as a low carbon fuel standard.
Super interesting. It strikes me as that's a far less risky approach as well, because if you have like a variety of different policy instruments, you never really know how well some of these things are going to play out really once you, because as you know, it's a lot of it has to do with public perception and behavior. It's a difficult thing to predict. So this when I look at this, of a diverse approach seems to me quite reasonable. So in terms of the efforts so far, we have some things that are holding us back from moving forward with this across these jurisdictions. And you've noted here, experts have known that there's a coordinated global efforts won't happen by voluntary agreement. So it's understood that that's necessarily the case. Decarbonizing electricity and transportation is achievable and globally critical, and renewables won't beat fossil fuels without compulsory policies, but carbon tax is not essential. So you've stated here, if experts know this, what's what's holding us back from making the progress that we need to make?
Yeah, thanks, David. There are so many barriers at the individual level, and of course at the corporate level, that influence government decisions, because governments in healthy democracy have to listen to every single stakeholder that comes to them. And I divide these barriers into four broad categories. First, there are deliberate delusions that are loved by the fossil fuel sector. People, have said for decades that climate science is uncertain. We don't know exactly when and how those tipping points will happen. That the next fossil fuel project, such as like in the next pipeline, is absolutely essential, or the next last LNG plant, absolutely essential. Or we must wait some major innovations in technology to decarbonize, to make sure that technology is very cheap before we implement any policy that requires the adoption of that technology. Whereas in fact, we know that policy creates markets, not markets create policy. And also, yeah, people have said in the past that there is no point in acting because we're just a fraction of the problem, therefore a fraction of solutions. So what's the point of acting if there is no global agreement? The reality is that the fossil fuel industry loves this kind of thinking and uses them, views to stall action. And then there are perfectionism views. And this drives me crazy because I work with a lot of very smart people in the academic community, and we argue between each other about the most perfect way to achieve emission reductions. The most concerned climate people have their rigid pro and con positions about decarbonization options. Some people say that we need to use only nuclear power. Some people say we must not ever use nuclear power. Same with large hydropower, like things like Site C. Same with biofuels. Many people argue that obviously biofuels have associated emissions that are not being captured in our current GG counting systems quite well. People also argue about using carbon capture and storage and or using carbon taxes for reducing emissions. So we argue about the most perfect ways to reduce emissions. And again, fossil fuel industry just loves this rigidity. The key is to not let perfection be the enemy of the good. A third class of barrier is wishful thinking biases. Again, people like you and me may unintentionally get involved in nurturing our wishful thinking biases that again prevent the implementation of effective and compulsory climate policies. We have these beliefs that energy efficiency investments must is the main policy to be used by governments, that all the economic recovery money for the post-COVID recovery must be spent on energy efficiency, when in fact we know that energy efficiency is not cheap and easy, as you mentioned through Mark's example of using LED light bulbs and many other technologies. I have an electric vehicle. It broke down immediately once I bought it because new technology takes time to work. We need a lot of it on the market for it to work perfectly. Those kind of investments are not necessarily the cheapest. There are beliefs that renewables are outcompeting fossil fuels, but as I said earlier, without climate policy in place, renewables will not be outcompeting fossil fuels. They're also intermittent. They require backup capacity or battery storage that is quite expensive. And for the most part, academics don't include those estimates in the cost of renewables. There is also a belief that we must focus all of our efforts on removing fossil fuel subsidies, which we do have in Canada, and they're large and they're disgusting. I completely support removing fossil fuel subsidies, but under stringent climate policy, subsidies have no impact on emissions. Those climate policies actually drive emissions down without any impact from fossil fuel subsidies. And there are also beliefs such as that divestment campaigns, the ones that we are doing like at Royal Rhodes University or UVic, will have a big effect. So every single corporation or business or public sector organization should spend their time on divestment campaigns. Again, the fossil fuel industry loves this wishful thinking biases and keeps relying on them in order to stall climate action. In fact, I have a very funny example. When I worked in the BC government, I've witnessed the oil and gas sector coming in and lobbying for carbon taxes. They were saying, we just want a super high carbon tax because this is the most efficient and innovative policy that encourages innovation, and therefore let's just do big carbon tax. And they know quite well that no government in the world will implement a $300 carbon tax in order to address climate change. So there are like this, tricky ways of lobbying the government using.
It's like the straw man. Here you go. It's not going to necessarily have any effect. Back to this point here, though, this slide about perfectionist views. I remember that paper back, Pakala and Sakalo in 2004. Do you remember that one, the energy wedges article, which was a classic at the time? And what I liked about that article, because it argued for, there's no, and it depends on the context of the country. It depends on what resources you have. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, maybe large scale nuclear is not an option for you, but, CCS or large scale hydro, which it is more of an option. And, that was actually a pretty successful paper and idea in the policy community, even way back then, that's 16, 17 years ago, because it presented some options. It wasn't like, this is the only way to get there. Here's kind of, some wedges that can be implemented from a policy standpoint to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And the reality, David, is that there is no perfect way. Every single way or a mix of ways will have implications, environmental implications that are beyond greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is that if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, those environmental implications will be much larger. So it's hard to be a politician. You always have to make this trade-off decisions that, when you implement a certain policy, you affect certain groups of population or certain sectors of the economy. There is no decision that has zero other implications or trade-off impacts in policy making, in any area of policy making. Forget about environmental policy. Governments deal with multiple objectives on a daily basis, which is what makes government work very interesting and very challenging. And so finally, in terms of barriers, there are also agenda hitching biases. Again, people like you and me and a lot of ecological economists like to say that we need to completely stop population growth. We need to stop eating meat, flying planes, driving cars. Just forget about the economic growth or capitalism. Let's achieve global equity before we move into climate action. All these biases make the challenge of deep decarbonization sound far more complex than it is. And again, the fossil fuel industry just loves this agenda hitching biases and uses them anytime there is an opportunity. And finally, of course, what's holding back deep decarbonization is climate insincere politicians. Just in the time of Donald Trump, almost 99 regulations for environmental regulations were reversed, and out of them most are climate-related air pollution and greenhouse gas emission regulations, as well as regulations associated with drilling and extraction of oil and gas. And this is significant, even for the new government, for the Biden administration. It will take some time to put some of these policies back in place, and this is a waste of time. We don't have time to not act on climate change.
So what are some of these? So you've outlined here safe bets and wild cards, because I mean, this is something we talked about before. Risk, like what's a really risky option, i.e. a wild card, and what are some more safer bets that we can kind of have trust in?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a report not by me. This is a report by the Institute for Climate Choices located in Ottawa that did this report in relation to Canada's commitment to net zero future by 2050. This is what the Liberal government proposed, to decrease our emissions below zero by 2050. So what that means for our lifestyles, for our technologies, for our economies. So this particular slide shows these different kind of realms of safe bets versus wildcards. And safe bets represent those technologies that are already commercially available and have very little challenges to be implemented and adopted at the wide scale by individuals and by businesses. And those include electric vehicles in transportation, heat pumps in the building sector, energy efficiency equipment, non-emitting electricity, and energy and carbon capture and storage. And most of these technologies can bring us very close to our targets. And in fact, the announced Liberal climate plan, the $170 carbon tax, as well as the new budget announcements, probably bring us very close to achieving our targets, but we also need to do extra work in order to be truly net zero. And that includes doing more work on land use in terms of how we deal with deforestation and developing our communities, as well as issues of hydrogen and other technologies that are not necessarily commercially available at this point. And those, especially land use issues, they're not simple because they have to do with indigenous rights for land, and they have to do with many other aspects of stakeholder involvement that need to be carefully considered. But in general speaking, we can reduce our emissions using these commercially available technologies, and these technologies do not require every single citizen in Canada and beyond to switch from driving a car to biking to work every day. In many cases, it's just simply not just convenient. It's simply not feasible for people to bike with their children to daycare along the highway. Those are some of the additional infrastructure issues that need to be addressed in additional policy through land use policy. But in the meantime, we don't have time to sit and wait for everyone to change their behavior. We should really try to address the key emitting sectors and the right technologies to address emissions in those sectors, especially, like I said earlier, in electricity, transportation, and buildings.
I've noticed on this graph, which I found quite interesting, if you look at this, for those that are watching and maybe just looking at this, obviously looking at this perhaps for the first time, you look in the bottom right, it says minimum contribution across sectors and full potential across sectors, right? So this, the full part is like, so when you see the dark blue, that's the minimum contribution, and the full contribution is the lightly shaded part. So if you look at the safe bets and you look at CCS, carbon capture, I mean, the minimum contribution is quite small, but the full potential is quite significant, implying that there's quite a bit of potential for CCS if we seek to pursue it. And in Canada, we're actually pretty good. We've have a pretty fairly decent experience in the energy and the oil and gas sectors in Alberta in carbon capture and storage. Obviously, there needs to be more work on it. So I mean, when you look at that, and that is one of the policies, CCS, carbon capture and storage, that a lot of environmental folks, quote unquote, would like, no, like you can't do that, as a like that's not a green policy. Whereas, I mean, it's something definitely to be considering.
Yeah, and so the minimum contribution piece refers mostly to the current policy that the Liberal government has announced.
Okay.
And the lighter circles refer to the full potential. So what if we increase the stringency of the announced clean fuel standard? What if we increase the stringency of the carbon tax? What if we have additional policy to mandate electric vehicle sales, similar to what the Conservative government now is proposing in their plan? So if we were to actually target the maximum contribution from existing commercially available technologies, there is a lot of opportunity to reduce our emissions.
Um, so what's the takeaway then? Like, what is what can we walk away from this with in terms of, like, we've seen the doom and gloom scenario and not the doom and gloom, but the potential problems down the road if we don't see the changes that need to be made. And then we've seen some of the kind of the trick cards that are called sometimes in terms of wishful thinking or insincere politicians and so forth. So walking away from this discussion, like what are some success stories and simple paths that we can kind of put in our mind as the key takeaways?
Absolutely, and I want these messages to be heard and understood by a variety of people, even those who are students who don't have money to buy a zero-emission vehicle or a heat pump for their home. So your job is to identify, elect, and support climate-sincere politicians. Those are the people who implement compulsory climate policy, so be it regulations or carbon pricing, and they focus that policy on the main emitting sectors. And if you remember from my previous slides, those sectors are electricity, transportation, followed by buildings and light industry. These politicians also implement a mix of different compulsory climate policy to drive innovation and to reduce costs of decarbonization. And they link their jurisdictions and their policy to other jurisdictions to enable more of a global effort. So they lead multi-country coal and oil phase-out campaigns, and they also work together to enact carbon tariffs, something that is likely to be way more effective than a global climate agreement, because if countries like the European Union countries, Canada and the US have carbon tariffs, then the rest of the world will have to adjust and comply as well. So if you have politicians already elected, if it's not an election time, then try to do your best to get engaged in engagement consultation processes, write letters, push those politicians to implement flexible regulation, carbon pricing, use the COVID-19 pandemic recovery as a policy window. So for example, what I did is that I participated in a town hall back in July when the BC government was requesting feedback from the general public and experts on the issues of economic recovery in British Columbia. And I've seen many of those, my suggestions, strategies being adopted in the Green Party policy platform and some of the current government's actions. And also, as I said earlier, push politicians to broaden their actions to join other jurisdictions, similar to how BC followed California, and then now the federal government is following the BC lead. It's really good to work together. We can learn a lot from each other. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. And finally, if you do have an opportunity, if you want to use the current incentives and incentives and supports that are offered by governments here in British Columbia and also at the federal level, you can purchase an electric car or install a heat pump. And those two key technologies at the personal level will reduce most of your emissions. And when there is no hope, David, I think activism is the only action. I think we should all go out and speak out, engage ourselves in protests to make sure that climate insincere governments don't last.
Okay. Well, we've got some good questions coming in. Carrie's got a good point here. So first, Carrie, I just opened the chat. I didn't see this. Carrie, thanks for shooting these in. We want to mix it up. And anybody, if you have any questions, this is a time. So we've got a great expert on the line here. This is a good chance to kind of pick her brain. First, Carrie's point when we're talking about carbon taxation in reference to Sweden and Norway and Scandinavia, but the carbon taxes there, while high, were only applied to, or are only applied to, a small subset of economic activities. From what I don't know that, but what's your response to Carrie's point about how they've used carbon taxation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a pure carbon tax. In fact, the carbon tax was introduced in place of existing fossil fuel taxes. So it was way easier to implement the tax because it wasn't very additional for the most part, was just replacing existing taxes. And this speaks again to my point to how difficult carbon taxes are in general everywhere in the world, even in those countries where trust in government is much higher. They haven't removed the carbon tax, so I see it as a test of survival of the policy. It's existed for many, many years. Uh, People in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries trust their governments in terms of government spending. So governments can decide to invest in district energy heating and have everyone hooked up to the heating system that's zero emissions, and people will be okay with that. Try to do the same in Canada. Try to tell people that you're changing the heating system for them. It's a completely different story. So yes, carbon tax is at a high level in Sweden. It has lots of exemptions, and it was introduced in place of existing fuel taxes. So that speaks to, again, the political difficulty of implementing pure, stringent, and high enough carbon taxes.
Next point, Carrie's put a question here. That's a great path. So these suggestions for climate concerned citizens, these are great suggestions. Go get a heat pump, go buy an electric car as opposed to another one. But how do we get a critical mass of citizens to be sufficiently climate concerned? How do you, and this is getting to, and this is kind of speaks to some of the work that you've done on behavior and perceptions of different policy instruments and so forth.
So what's interesting is that we don't really need to have a critical mass of citizens to be climate concerned. For the most part, if of course we don't have climate sincere politicians in place, then and people don't care, then of course nothing will be happening. But I think we already have the most important people concerned with the climate change issue, and those are the people who go and vote for particular political parties that would support or oppose the climate policy file. When I was doing my PhD, I was actually very interested in the idea of educating people or not educating people, especially in the light of introducing a serious carbon tax here in BC, as well as other regulations that were in fact more effective in reducing emissions, such as the clean electricity standard and the low carbon fuel standard. Than the carbon tax. So what I did is I did a survey of British Columbians, and I asked them an open-ended question first: what kind of climate policies they thought were implemented in British Columbia at the time. And 75% of respondents could not name one policy, but the remaining 25% of respondents named the carbon tax. No one could name one regulatory policy. And then you give them the list of real policies implemented in BC, the carbon tax and the two regulatory policies I just mentioned. You ask them about the level of support for those policies. You explain what those policies are, how they work, and they ask about their support. People showed much higher support for regulations than for the carbon tax, because people don't realize how regulations impact the cost of electricity or the cost of fuel at a pump. They have much lower cost. Tax has a very visible price signal that is experienced right away when you go get gas for your vehicle, or when you pay for your natural gas bill for heating your home, versus regulations. They implicitly increase the cost of living. For example, the clean electricity standard, when introduced here in BC, canceled BC Hydro's plans to build natural gas plants and one coal plant for electricity generation, but that increased our electricity rates here in BC, and no one knew. So what I learned from that research is that people are not aware and they support way more effective climate policy regardless of its cost. And when you give people information about the expected emission reductions from those policies, they actually get scared and support decreases. So I think people in a healthy democracy, we have all the resources available to people to go on the website, government website, to learn about particular policy. But people don't want to know a lot of detail. They are busy with their own lives, and they filter any information through their system of values and worldviews. And it's so difficult to change people's minds and to change their behavior in general. It almost doesn't make sense to provide extensive educational campaigns to every single citizen in the country. So from my perspective, we need to make sure that the critical mass includes people who are in fact influential in policy making processes, those who actually go and vote. And for the most part, those who don't vote, they are concerned or not concerned. I don't care what they think, as long as those who vote make the right choices. So I hope
and that the choices, though, and in addition to that, that they have the choices to make. You know, that the policies that are presented are legitimate and going to actually realize the reductions that we need to see. I can add to that, if I may, just some anecdotal or practical insights that I've gleaned from working with corporate leaders. And it's been very interesting throughout the last 10, 15 years of experiencing why they do or do not take a progressive stance on, say, climate change or environmental sustainability as a whole. And it's surprising in some cases. Like, I'll give you a specific example, which is the CEO of Puma, or then CEO of Puma, Jochen Zeitz. And they have been very, very progressive with climate change, as well as with water use and a very ecosystem services in general. They're one of the few companies, if not the only company, to first come out with an environmental profit and loss account for their whole corporation, and have spread that throughout the parent company. And when asked him about that, I said, well, you know, was this just simply to be a good corporate citizen, you know, because that's often the case. And he was like, well, I mean, that's part of it, because we're a consumer facing brand, right? You're going to the store to buy Puma products. But in addition to that, and what he said was most important at this stage, and this is also like, this is in 2012 at Rio Plus 20, so it's not yesterday, was risk. He said, we are running a company that is dependent upon natural resources and subjected to disturbances that are naturally induced, such as droughts, extreme storm events, and so forth and so on. By going and doing an environmental profit and loss account, it forces us to dig into how reliant we are and how vulnerable we are to environmental change. And he said, for that reason alone, it's worth it for us to do this, to have a better profile or understanding strategically of risk exposure. And the same story I experienced with the Mexican Banking Association when talking with them. I said, look, I mean, you have more to lose by not addressing or understanding these potential risks from drought in Mexico and so forth than you have to gain from being ignorant of them, right? So there's that kind of practical reality of a decision maker in this current, you know, Anthropocene in which we live. Carrie, one more question that you put. Carrie is on fire tonight. Thanks for coming out, Carrie. You're making this fun. Given that we need the Chinas and other developing countries and developing country emitters to sign on, as well as for decarbonization, what would you suggest Canada and others should do to incentivize them to do so? So how do we get, you know, some of the big emitters that are out there that we've shown in this presentation, like China and like India, for instance, to kind of like come to the table?
Yeah, I'm actually really not worried about China. I think they will be just doing fine. In light of the presidential elections in the US, they implemented a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050, I believe. And it's just a target. It's not supported by compulsory climate policy that I described in this presentation. But it's a little bit different in China. When they say they have a target, when they have a commitment, it's a dictatorship state, so it's very different. I think that was the first sign that they were anticipating some carbon tariffs coming out of the Biden administration, and I think that's the only way to incentivize them is by imposing carbon tariffs on all those products that are coming into Canada and the US, and again, design them in such a way that there is no huge initial cost so that businesses can adjust, similar to flexible regulations. Start with a small requirement and increase it over time, gives businesses and people kind of certain future to plan for, but have that future in place and keep increasing it in its stringency. I think carbon tariffs and coalitions between different countries in terms of common goals to phase out coal, oil, and then most uses of natural gas are the way to go and the way to encourage those countries to decarbonize. But we are also helping the developing world by taking domestic actions here, by implementing stringent compulsory climate policy in rich countries. We are helping the developing world to skip the technology commercialization stage, to skip that part of, constantly reducing the cost of technology. We are giving them the cheaper technology already without their investment in research and development and commercialization, and without having the need to have compulsory policies in place in their jurisdictions. So in a way, I think the developing world can skip a lot of stages in their development and get in this more or less zero emission economy transition faster if we lead in rich countries.
Given the fact though that, and I'll give you a practical example, this is kind of recent stuff for us, given the fact that they have the leadership to do so, right? The developing country, like if you're in a developing country, I'm going to give you the example of Guyana, Northeast and South America. So we've been working with the government of Guyana with UNEP, UN Environment Program. And so in the previous government, they had quite a progressive government that was open to these kind of like, green futures, and they, in collaboration with the UNEP, established the GSDS, the Green State Development Strategy, which was just like probably one of the most progressive green policy framers across all the SDGs. So I worked on the M&E program with the UN colleagues and so forth. They were a client. We'd get this thing ready all the way, did all the economics. We had a good economist from South America. And then guess what happens? They have an election that's contested, but then ends up going to the opposition. And they said, okay, well, thank you very much. We have a huge offshore oil and gas find. Exxon's running the offshore oil and gas, one of the biggest in the world. And we're just gonna like put this on the shelf for now. So there's this kind of situation that we have to understand the reality in many developing world countries where, when given the opportunity for significant economic gains, and this is kind of basically taking a country that is a very needs a lot of infrastructure development at the base level to a significantly higher level in the development spectrum. And if the leadership of that country chooses to go in that direction, there's not much we can do about it. A question from one of the attendees. I was in Denmark in 2019. I learned that the Danish government taxed citizens 180% on the price of purchase for a vehicle, so the locals take a closer look when buying a car. Do you consider this measure to be too extreme? So that's just like on a vehicle itself, 180% tax.
Yeah, Singapore does a similar thing. So there are policies that can really discourage driving. And in those countries, there is very established infrastructure to adopt alternative transportation modes, such as transit or biking. Mm-hmm. There is almost no economic sense and like even convenience sense in driving. So in those places, governments can choose to tax driving at a very high level. And in those places, we also have governments where citizens trust them to a very high level, and there are no issues of re-election. If that kind of policy gets introduced, there will be not too much of opposition from the general public. Imagine that kind of policy here in North America. Mm-hmm. So yes, effective, of course effective, and this tells you that taxation, the carbon taxation, or the opposite, like removing taxes from certain low carbon technology, is a very difficult policy to implement. What Norway did to encourage their zero emission vehicle adoption, and they are going to be 100% sales of EVs in 4 years. They will not have any gasoline vehicles on the market sold to Norwegians. They removed the sales tax from, which was giant, from the purchase of zero emission vehicles, which created a huge incentive to people to purchase those. Mm-hmm. So very important to consider all sorts of kind of global and local implementation contexts for those countries, and to pay attention to governance structures and how much people trust their governments.
And also like some of the other issues that are associated with greenhouse gas emissions, like congestion, right? That's a big one. Like London's congestion tax on vehicles, getting a tariff for entering the city core with a vehicle, which has been by and large fairly successful. And Montreal is looking at doing a similar type of thing, which is aimed it's not necessarily directed exclusively at greenhouse gases. It's more about, I mean, congestion, but it tackles that problem as well. And those kind of economic instruments can be very successful, and are duly needed in some other parts of the world, like Istanbul could benefit a lot from that.
Yeah,
of course, go
I'm
ahead.
not arguing. I'm not arguing against taxation. I'm arguing for a mix of policies and perhaps even framing policies as a congestion tax rather than a carbon tax can be helpful. And
Yeah.
if we have a bunch of different taxes working at the same time,
Yeah.
piling up on top of each other, total into a higher carbon tax signal,
Yeah.
then here we go. We have a policy in place that consists of multiple different policies.
I think one of the reasons why congestion taxes, or at least in certain cases, have been successful, because they're very understandable. Like, people get it. I'm like, okay, I get it. I'll just take the tube then, or whatever. Or I'm okay because I'm going to take the car one day a week downtown, and I'll have that, and I'm willing to pay that price. Another question here: what are your thoughts on carbon offsets? Personal carbon offsets, so like bullfrog power being one example. This is from Sarah. What's your take on carbon offsets?
Yeah, offsets is not a new policy. It's been used in the last, again, 3 decades by governments at, you can apply those to individuals or businesses. Either way, offsets have a lot of free riders. You're paying someone to do something that they would have done likely anyway. And of course, that kind of policy becomes very administratively complex very quickly if you want it to work properly. If you want to ensure that emission reductions from offsets are additional, then you need to have a pretty good verification system in place. Mm-hmm. And those verifiers must not have a personal self-interest bias, but their job depends on verifying those offsets. So there is a personal self-interest bias, and it will always be there. So it is a very tricky policy, but all the research shows that the rate of free ridership associated with offsets are quite high.
Yeah, we've done a fair bit of work in the forest carbon offsets and avoided deforestation, and it's tricky stuff. I mean, it's tricky on so many different levels: additionality, the process of verification, monitoring. You get a lot of equity issues, especially in the developing world. When you're talking about REDD plus, projects, it was REDD originally. And, land tenure is itself a huge issue in a lot of developing countries, never mind looking at all the carbon revenue that you can, projected to gain from using that land for a carbon offset, right? So again, it's not a tricky, it's not a simple issue, nor are those simple projects to.
And quantification of forest carbon emissions is not an easy issue to tackle. It's not a combusted emission from a tailpipe. It's completely different, and you have to understand all these different species of trees and their growth patterns. And I'm not a forest scientist, but I've had some exposure to that, and you have to have really good methodologies to account for those emissions, which is, it becomes complicated very quickly.
Yeah, I've spent some time on flux towers above Amazonian rainforests. So I know that's about as best as you're going to get in terms of measuring carbon in and out of a forest. At best, you're going to get a lot of forest carbon projects. They go out with a tape measure and measure, like do a transect for 10 meters and measure the diameter of the trees at your chest height. And then, multiply that by the species, and there you go. That's your carbon value. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get that even better. Anyway, we're well over an hour. Sorry for taking so much of your time, but you certainly you certainly got people thinking. We had a lot of questions. It's awesome. So unless there's any other questions, I'm going to thank Katya for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your work and putting some of these issues so clearly on the table. It's a very clear explanation of a topic right now that is very important and also noisy. Like in the media and in the political sphere, there's a lot of kind of politicizing climate change and politicizing climate policies, whether it be from sincere politicians who have different opinions on how to go about achieving objectives, through to insincere politicians who really just want to kind of get elected and have their base not be disrupted in any way, shape, or form. So you've given us some material that we can arm ourselves as voters and citizens and people to make changes in our own lives, and then also make more educated decisions when it comes to voting and making decisions about political platforms and other policy instruments. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming on. Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing what your next projects are and what's your next big thing, project-wise, work-wise, research-wise.
Well, we're starting this $1.7 million grant project on the coexistence of climate sustainability and economic growth. The rationale for that is that, again, as I said earlier, there are this perfectionism views or rigid views about the need to stop economic growth. So we're going to do the study of empirical evidence in some of the most progressive jurisdictions in the world to understand, has the economy been negatively affected by climate policy? What do people think about their lifestyles? Do they feel like by reducing emissions to almost zero, their lifestyles are being dramatically impacted? So my part will be doing international surveys of the public in the world, in developing and developed countries, to understand their perceptions of deep decarbonization and economic growth. So that's the next big project. And I think, I hope I've given people enough information and tools to now sit and think about the proposed conservative climate plan, because it has a lot of flexible climate regulations. It has a zero emission vehicle mandate. It has a low carbon fuel standard. It has a renewable natural gas standard that basically copied the Clean BC climate plan and reduced the carbon tax, potentially appealing to some swing voters. So I want people to kind of, sit down, look into the details and to think what they think about the proposed plan. It's quite an aggressive approach that the Conservative government has taken. They've never done anything like this on the climate file. Versus the Liberal plan and the announced changes in the budget, including slashing in half corporate taxes for zero emission technology producers.
So what would you say then, in terms of if you were to give a letter grade to the Conservative plan versus the Liberal plan at this current state? What would your be? I'm going to put you on the spot.
So you don't want your students to do their homework.
Well, no. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a very smart move to attract those swing voters in jurisdictions that are concerned with climate change, but share more of conservative values in general. The policies are quite solid. The modeling that was done for the Conservative government shows that the policies can get Canada to similar emission levels as the Liberal government policies. I really don't think that the Liberal government needed to introduce the $170 carbon tax. I think it may backfire because that will be the main kind of focus of the Conservative government campaign, to disregard the policy and to explain how hurtful it is, again, to lie. And I'm concerned deeply about the polarization of views within the Conservative Party, given that a couple of weeks before announcing the climate plan, within their own party, they disagreed on the existence of climate change. The majority voted against the issue of climate change. It's just not acknowledging that it's real. So I personally won't vote for the Conservative Party, but many people may change their opinions once they see that the party is proposing to introduce these policies. Will they introduce these policies? Will the public hold them accountable? That's another question. So I think it's a smart move on their part to attract those swing voters.
Well, and also just to add, and this is why I wanted to throw that out there, because there's a tendency in Canada historically, like this is going back 30, 40 years, of a Conservative government naturally being bad for the environment. Like there's this kind of there is this almost like an ideological bent. And, we have to look at the policies. This is what my message, and I think we have the same kind of opinion on this. Because even in Canadian history, some of the most progressive and successful environmental policies have come from a conservative government, from the Mulroney government, right? Clearly, it's in look at the results that were achieved. Now, I'm not saying that the same thing will happen with this policy framework or this version of a conservative government, because that was a progressive conservative government at a different time with a different makeup. And there is a lot more polarization within that party today than perhaps there was then. But the moral of the story is do the homework, look at the policy. You've got some advice from an expert to see, okay, well, what is sincere, what's insincere, and what's going on in the world. And that can inform you and look at smoke and mirrors as well. Look at things that may look good, but maybe aren't that good, right? So there we go. I think you've gotten your money's worth tonight, everybody, in terms of your time spent. Again, Katya, thanks for coming on. These people have a lot of homework to do, so you need not worry about them having homework to think about, and this is going to be stuff that's going to help them move forward with the assignments they're working on. So thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. And for those that are going to come back next week, we have Dr. Leslie King. Those in the class, you'll know about this, and she's with Royal Roads University, and we're going to be talking about IPLCs, so Indigenous peoples and local communities, so Indigenous perspectives on development. And Leslie's got a ton of experience in this area. She's a great person. It's going to be a great talk. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody. And feel free to be in touch with both of us.
Thank you. Bye.